Welcome. My name is Emma Merrigan, and I use she, her pronouns. This is the third part of the series Accessible Affinity Programming, created by the Center for Diversity and Inclusion at Washington University in St. Louis. Now that we've covered accessible language in the previous video, let's move on to designing accessible program goals and modalities. When imagining your program's ideal outcome, consider the following questions. Firstly, in what ways might people with varying abilities and disabilities creatively achieve your objectives? Also, what forms of support or accommodations might you provide so that your goals can be more accessible? For example, if one of your goals is to create a social affinity space, think about what barriers to community and conversation might prevent disabled folks from coming to or engaging in your event. Is the space accessible? Is there a conversational structure that can help ease anxieties about meeting new people? What kind of information can you share about the event activities in advance to let people know that there are multiple ways to interact in the space? Will there be any downtime for people to rest from socializing? Of course, these might be questions you would ask anyway, but adding disability to your definition of inclusion and accessibility can encourage you to think even more creatively and flexibly about options for all community members to engage, regardless of their status as able, disabled, or somewhere in between. We touched on this in the video about accessible language, but at a minimum, you should provide tools for participants to socialize in various communication styles, whether by talking out loud, signing, writing, drawing, or any other creative styles that you can think of. Also understand that some members of your affinity community will just not feel comfortable in a social setting. So try to offer alternatives for them to engage in other ways as well whenever possible. Finally, I want to touch on program modalities, which have a lot to do with accessibility and programming logistics. How do you decide if you will hold your affinity programming in person, virtually, or with a hybrid model? There are pros and cons for disabled people with each option, so I've tried to summarize some of them here to help you decide which one will be the most accessible for you. Whenever possible, it is best to offer both in-person and online access to affinity programming. In-person programming helps to combat the isolation that is commonly felt by many disabled folks. On the other hand, online modalities allow for participants to engage without navigating ableist infrastructure. Both modalities do present some obstacles, however, which you'll want to consider in advance. For a virtual event, for example, you will need to decide in tandem with your participants whether or not to record the event. Recording can greatly expand access to those who can't attend synchronously for whatever reason. But some people may not want their disabilities disclosed or searchable to potential employers, professors, or acquaintances. Therefore, only record your event with caution and, if you have, the full informed consent of your participants. To get their consent, and in advance of the program, you should acknowledge the risks that could be involved, both verbally and in writing, before proceeding with recording. The biggest risk for disabled folks is stigmatization and discrimination. Even though the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits such discrimination, it still happens more often and more unconsciously than you might think. Finally, if you do choose to hold an event in person, make sure you reserve an accessible space and try to anticipate barriers to locating, entering, moving around, and exiting that space in advance. We will discuss this aspect more in detail in the videos about program logistics. If you'd like to find out more or contribute to the conversation about accessibility, disability, and affinity programming, email WashU's CDI at diversityandinclusion@woostel.edu, or send us a message on Facebook or Instagram at WUSTLCDI. Thank you for joining us.